Back in 2015, I was undertaking research for a book that I was co-authoring with Natalie Gruninger, entitled In the Footsteps of the Six Wives of Henry VIII. And it was a book detailing some of the most significant and interesting places associated with each of Henry VIII's queen consorts. And as part of this, I was tasked with researching the early life of Anne of Cleves. And in undertaking some preliminary research for my trip to Germany and what was once the Low Countries in search of those locations associated with Anne's early years, I came across a chance reference to a set of carved oak panels installed in a church in Old Warden, Bedfordshire. A scant number of pictures accompanied the suggestion that the panels had been installed by Lord Ongley of Old Warden, an eccentric English gentleman and, it seems, amateur antiquarian. But intriguingly, there was also the suggestion that originally the panels had come from Anne of Cleves Chapel in Bruges. Now, ultimately, this was to prove to be a red herring. However, fact turned out to be stranger, or shall I say more interesting than fiction. So in this short film, we want to tell the story of those panels and their provenance. It is an exceptional story with several incredible twists and turns which saw the team involved in investigating their provenance learnt from disappointment to jubilation on more than one occasion. From the outset, I teamed up with local historian and Ongley biographer Christine Hill. Christine brought with her a wealth of local information and hearsay about the history of the panels. We knew that at least some of the panels had been collected by Robert, Lord Ongley, and installed here in St Leonard's Church, Old Warden, during the period 1841 to 1842, amid a range of salvaged continental carvings. From the mid-19th century through to the early 21st century, antiquarians, enthusiasts and historians alike had commented on the likely nature of the panels, each drawing disparate conclusions as to their age, geographic origins, and some saying they were Jacobean in date, others that they had come from the 18th or 19th century, and the origins of the panels had been given as widely as England, France or the Low Countries. The panels, of which there are 22, were carved into 3 separate designs. The first, which has the initials AC, surmounted by a ducal coronet, had given rise to the legend of the panels as being associated with Anne. Up until that point, as far as we could tell, very little had been said about the 2 remaining designs. One of these designs looks like a rimless spoked wheel, the third and final design being a roaring lion's head. Much of the commentary on the panels had hitherto focused on those bearing the AC initials. However, we soon uncovered that the panels with the spoked wheel design bore the emblem of Cleves. Christine and I could not find an instance of this being noted in the past, but it gave us our first positive link to the princess from Cleve. However, an even more pivotal link was soon to be unearthed. Christine came across a reference to Anne of Cleves' tomb in Westminster Abbey. Now, the tomb occupies a prominent spot adjacent to the high altar of the abbey. It's actually only partially finished, yet very clearly visible on the front of the tomb are exactly the same 3 designs, but this time carved in marble. This was a highly significant find and showed that the panels in Old Warden Church represented the arms of Cleves. So they were not Jacobean, nor 18th century in origin, and the question now became, were the panels contemporary with Anne's lifetime and therefore of enormous historical interest, given that they would very likely have belonged to her? Or were they simply later copies of a very visible tomb made by antiquarians who wanted to emulate Tudor royal style? It was at this point that I realised we needed specialist input, and that with developments in technology and scientific analysis, we might crack that case once and for all. And so I contacted Jonathan Foyle, architectural historian, fresh from having identified the marriage bed of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York through its symbolism, provenance, and forensics. So it is to Jonathan that we now turn to hear more of the panels and how we went about investigating their provenance.
When I came to examine the so-called Anne of Cleves panels here at St Leonard's Old Warden back in February 2015, I found 22 panels dispersed throughout this really rich interior. And they were of three types. One, like this, was a cartouche, an oval frame with a crown over it. Others were lion's masks. Third was called an escarbuncle, so basically like a spoke wheel, but with a fleur-de-lis at the end of the spokes. But what were they? And where'd they come from? Now, as Sarah has mentioned, legend had it that at least some of these panels were installed by Robert Lord Ongley in around 1840 or 41, at a time when there was a revival of interest in all things Tudor, largely spurred by the opening of Hampton Court to the public in 1838. Now, we can confirm that these panels on the chancel arch were in place by 1854 to go by two lithographs made that year by the Bedfordshire architect John Sunman Austin. He shows the same shape of cartouche with a crown over the top, and we can see now that they've got swags and an AC and a knot between them, and here they remain in place. But the altar is a mid-20th century object, and it has 11 panels symmetrically arrayed of all three types. So where have these come from 100 and so years later than the ones on the chancel arch? Have these come from somewhere else in the church and been reused? Was there a store of them salvaged from a nearby house? To answer those questions, what can the surface and the reverse of them tell us? On close inspection, it's clear that the panels are of really high quality, but in such good condition, they don't immediately look to be 16th century. Now, the thing is, when analysing important historic furniture and carving, condition is the first impression, but it's not the best indicator of age, because some Tudor carving of really good quality imported Baltic oak can remain remarkably crisp, whereas Victorian and later copies can be made to look old, even reuse old wood. And in the case of Henry VII's bed, Victorian pew varnish can mask the natural patina and age of the object itself. These are giving us very few clues. It made sense to go back to basics and look at the panels that we know had been here in situ the longest, from the early Victorian period. And looking at this panel closely, you can see it's got some wear around the edges, but something caught my eye, a crusty deposit in the tassels. And working out what that was would be really significant toward our understanding these panels. What about those 11 panels fixed to the altar frontal? Now, this was self-evidently their secondary usage, at least. Some had been trimmed so that the carved flowers had been cropped, and that's significant. By climbing into the hollow altar, the reverse was visible, with some showing nail holes and dried fungal residue. These features indicated they were once fixed onto a previous fairly damp location. But more tellingly, all the panels bore a uniform level of oxidization that's closely similar to that of the rotary sawn oak main elements of the altar. Now, that may be the case if they were planed or sanded, or if they were made at a similar time to the frame that held them. Well, all in all, first appearances suggested that the age of these altar panels may not be much older than the 20th century altar they were affixed to. This was worrying if we're thinking that these may be 16th century originals. We had to go deeper than just the visual or physical evidence to establish the likely dating of these panels. Now, one way to do it is through forensic analysis, so that tiny flecks of paintwork remaining on the surface of the wood can be sampled and examined microscopically. High-status 16th century panelling was often painted in vivid colours or gilded. If these had once existed on the surface, then specific pigments and binders which were used in that period before modern chemical colours, that would be detected, and it would provide valuable evidence of the panel's likely date. So, to start this analysis, I called in Helen Hughes, a specialist in the research and conservation of historic interiors. It's the results of this forensic analysis that we turn to next. So Helen set to work taking small samples from a selection of the panels, those that showed the greatest promise of applied finishes. Now, these samples were mounted in cross-section and examined under high magnification and ultraviolet light. Disappointingly, no traces of paint were observed on the surface of the wood, only repeated layers of varnish in the recesses of the carved mouldings. It was also clear that some of the early varnish layers had been removed at some date, and in some cases a layer of brown paint had been applied above early varnish, probably to ensure that the panels matched the colour and tonality of the surrounding old panelling and all this old salvage material. Now, there was, however, one other clue. The crusty deposit I'd seen in the tassels turned out to be a ground chalk. Now, that puzzled us. Why chalk? The evidence was just too thin for us to be able to move past the presumption that these must be some kind of revivals or copies. Because when you're analysing potentially important antiquities, they remain guilty until proven innocent. The key question here was, what can comparative work of Anne of Cleves tell us? Now, Christine and Sarah had wisely had a look at her tomb, and the panels there seemed to be similar. So what can a closer look at Anne of Cleves' tomb in Westminster Abbey tell us about the origins of these panels? Now, the comparison between Anne of Cleves' tomb and these carvings at Old Warden threw up several really interesting and potentially important things. Firstly, the AC on her tomb demonstrates that she alone used this device. She had no children. There was no other member of the Cleves dynasty who used the design you see here at Old Warden. So we're really pinpointing Anne herself at this level. Secondly, both designs on the tomb, and apparently the identical one here, show strap work. Now, that's a kind of design that looks like cut-out leather, and it became fashionable in Europe in the mid-1540s, about 1545 to 6. And that means that this design could not have featured in a chapel of Anne of Cleves at Bruges, given that she was in England 5 years before the continent started using these motifs. So they didn't predate her arrival in England. And that in turn begs a really important question, and that is this. If these panels were made in her lifetime, they must therefore predate the tomb, which is self-evidently the last thing she ever commissioned. But that's if they're genuine. And we have to find out now whether these panels at Old Warden were made by someone who copied the tomb in later centuries, or whether that tomb of hers used the same template that Tudor carvers had responded to in order to make these for a house she once lived in. Now that is a tantalizing possibility. Now, do you remember this point where you'd seen Anne of Cleves' tomb, hadn't you? And Christine had got photographs.
Absolutely. We'd found the tomb and we'd found the images of the panels on the tomb.
And what conclusion did you make from that?
Well, the images were identical to the panels in Old Warden Church. All three of the panels were identical. And so we had to conclude that the panels that we'd found at Old Warden Church were directly related to Anne of Cleves.
Yeah. Now, of course, we had all kinds of ideas from scholars, hadn't we?
Yeah.
Pevsner hedged his bets and said, it's supposed to come from a chapel, but what's Bruges got to do with her, and left it. And there was another book which suggested they were French and 18th century with a very firm scholarly attribution. But there are also 18th century carvings in here in a 19th century church. And here are we in the early 21st century thinking which one of these is correct.
Which scenario actually fitted.
Yeah.
And yet we were so close. We seemed so close to establishing the fact that these panels were directly related to Anne of Cleves. So where to from here?
I know, because the physical evidence on the surface had failed to materialise.
That's right.
Those panels in the altar had almost certainly been sanded and then put somewhere damp. So they gave us no information, no oxidisation, any of that obvious wear and tear, apart from a few nail holes, but...
And then there was the forensic evidence. We were hoping to find traces of pigment that would have linked the panels back to that phase, and yet it's just those chalky deposits.
They're carved so richly that you tend to think that they might have been painted quite richly as well, just given an extravagant surface treatment. It's just chalk. So you must have been quite frustrated at that point.
Oh, I was. We'd come so far.
Because here's me trying to help you, and I have to exercise the greatest caution in attribution. It has to be evidence-led, because there can be so many blind alleys or misconnections between, weak evidence. So we had to demonstrate really clearly that either her workshop responsible for her tomb knew of these panels and they both belonged to her lifetime, or that there was someone who had copied them and Ongley got hold of some revivalist pieces and stuck them in his church, because they weren't of any great value and no historical pedigree behind them, and so they just got cobbled together with this lot. And I remember thinking, you're very polite to me, but given that I'd come here to help you, it's tough. It was a tough gig for me, actually.
I remember the report finally coming in and thinking, well, that's it then. These are not contemporary to Anne's life. It was a good punt, but game over.
All of the evidence showed that they were relatable to her tomb, but not necessarily by any degree greater than someone with a drawing pad and a pencil and a tape, measuring it closely, going back to a workshop and knocking them off, really.
But then something quite amazing happened.
It was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Unbelievable.
There the story carries on. What happened next was the most ridiculous piece of serendipity. It came in May 2015, 3 months after I'd visited St Leonard's and done a survey, and about a month and a half after I'd given Sarah a fairly disappointing report to say that there was no evidence to suggest otherwise than these panels may have been carved in imitation of Anne of Cleves' tomb. But I wasn't satisfied with that conclusion. I didn't have the evidence, I had to be responsible. But there's a point at which you have to listen to what your gut tells you, because you can dismiss all kinds of things where the evidence may still exist. And so I searched online and I kept looking. And one evening, the almost miraculous happened. On an auction listing of Bonham's auction house was an oak panel, and it had AC on it and a coronet, and it was the same as those in this church. They dated that panel to around 1610 was their estimate, and that takes us 90% of the way back to the age of Anne of Cleves. This was going to be a revelation. The auction catalogue listing described this as a Jacobean panel of circa 1610 by repute from Northumberland House on the Strand. Now that's where Charing Cross Station stands today, and a palace there began life for the Dukes of Northampton, and then Suffolk, and then the Dukes of Northumberland. Well, they're N, S and N, nothing to do with AC, and we knew by comparison with Anne of Cleves' tomb that it referred specifically to her. So that seems to be a misunderstanding, nothing to do with that site. Given that it was dated so close to her lifetime, we have the tantalizing opportunity, if archaeology allows us to get any closer, to really nail it and match it to not just her own period of existence, but maybe one of the houses that she knew, looked at, touched herself. And this one panel gave us a unique possibility to do that, because this had not been covered in Victorian varnish. It had not been trimmed on its edges. It had an early surface finish. It had a crust. Does that ring a bell? When we got closer, it yielded remarkable and conclusive evidence. A closer look at the Bonham's panel revealed some really important things. Firstly, that crust over the bottom half was gesso, that is, chalk bound with glue so that it makes a hard shell. And when spread on furniture, gesso can protect it against the elements and against knocks, sometimes for a span of several centuries. Well, that could explain why the Old Warden panels were in such good condition. They'd been protected. But underneath the gesso of the Bonham's panel was further evidence. There was a dark, rectangular central section, and that was where the originally visible carved area of the panel had been waxed when it was set in its original frame. And you can see where the frame once was, because that's the lighter section around the outside. Now, the Old Warden panels had been trimmed and then covered in Victorian varnish, so that evidence was lacking here. The third opportunity was provided by the timber itself, because you could see on the end of the Bonham's panel a very good array of rings, growth rings within the oak tree that had been felled to make it. And so we gave the Bonham's panel to a leading dendrochronologist, a specialist in panel paintings across Europe. Dendrochronology is the study of tree rings. When you slice through a trunk or a branch of a tree, you'll see a radial pattern of rings. Each one represents a year's growth. By comparing trees in a certain area, a database of growth can be compared with a specimen of wood, and eventually a match should be found. In this case, the Bonham's panel matched oak growing in the area between the Netherlands and Germany, and the last ring was dated at 1525, which means it must have been felled and processed into a carved panel some point after that date. Typically, 1 or 2 decades is the difference. And Professor Peter Klein found that the Bonham's panel had been felled sometime after 1525. He thought the plausible date is sometime after 1544, when the trimmed newest rings had been accounted for. And 1544 is in Anne of Cleves' prime. It's 4 years after her divorce from Henry VIII, with a healthy settlement, and well before the tomb was made, clearly in emulation of the pattern that carvers had used to make not just the Bonham's panel, but by extension, all of those at St Leonard's Old Warden. What we discovered was a collection of national importance. So got there in the end.
We got there in the end. Finally. What a fantastic result.
That might be my epitaph. You were very patient with it, but
you took it a step further, because the questions didn't stop, did they? When we were able to say, this is what one of Anne of Cleves' interiors must have looked like, and this panel she may well have touched. The audiences, I mean, gosh, you think of the people who surrounded her, because Princess Elizabeth and Mary, they knew her as a kind of aunt, didn't they?
Yes, yes, indeed, yeah.
And so, where did you go with it? What did you think once we'd concluded it was in one of her houses?
Well, I'd been researching some of the properties, obviously, that Anne of Cleves had stayed in, had lodged in the latter part of her life. And so I was really curious to think, well, where might this have come from? Where might this set have actually originated? And there were probably two main contenders for that. One was the Palace of Bletchingley, and
that's Surrey, isn't it?
That's in Surrey, yes. And there's an interesting tomb in the church there of her Lord Steward, Sir Thomas Cawadden, and I think you've seen the pictures of that, and we discussed it, didn't we, about the kind of strap work on the tomb, and how that may have mirrored and come from the same design workshop.
It looks like the same workshop, and as her steward, he must have been responsible for a good deal of her domestic life. I mean, she retired in some style, didn't she, from marriage to Henry VIII. She seemed to be the queen, although history has marked her down as the reject. Practically, she must have been delighted with the outcome, I would have thought, of a pension for life and not having to live with Henry.
Indeed, indeed. However, I think she was a little bit homesick towards the end of her life, and when you contacted me with the results of the dendrochronology, and we found out that the wood itself had come from essentially her homeland, that seemed to be a quite nice, poignant connection. Now, maybe it was just the great quality of wood from that area, but the romantic in me liked to think that she was trying to get some kind of connection back to her Clevish origins.
So there's a couple of great possibilities then. Dartford Priory was one of her houses,
that's the other one, yes, absolutely.
And Bletchingley Manor was another one, of which nothing is left really. A bit of archaeology a few years ago, but otherwise nothing. And then there's Cawadden's tomb, as you said. So we're building a picture then of in the middle of the 1540s. As soon as strapwork on the continent becomes fashionable, it's that retired queen who introduces it to England, because there's no earlier evidence of it in England. She's not Henry's reject. She's a trendsetter, holding her own court, showing off her own coronet and family arms, in no way taking umbrage, but dressing one of her houses, probably Bletchingley would be my guess, with spectacular style.
Yes, indeed. It must have looked amazing, and I'd love to be able to recreate the room where these panels once were decorating its walls.
Well, we're now much closer than ever was the case when she was supposed to have had a chapel in Bruges. We can knock that one on the head. But the final thing for her, in my mind, is that same design being translated into her tomb. Her death in 1557 meant that presumably Cawadden, as a steward taking over her affairs, said, well, here is a plat that was approved by Anne of Cleves, and therefore he gave that to the carvers of the tomb, and she resides in a pole position in Westminster Abbey, doesn't she?
Absolutely, right next to the high altar.
And overlooking the coronation place.
Indeed, yes.
And so where Henry VIII is under a floor in Windsor, with no,
what an irony.
with no monument to him, she has been observing the coronation of every King and Queen of England since.
Yes. And I don't know about you, Jonathan, don't you feel there was so much serendipity in this journey that it was almost as if these panels wanted to be found?
You know, I've had to exercise great responsibility and caution as an archaeologist when I've looked at them, but I can't help but agree with you. There's something spooky about the way it all fell together.
Yeah.
But it's a bit privileged to be part of, so thank you.
Thank you.